Good afternoon. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Table Talk. Looks like we are indeed live. Trust if you're following already on the live stream or if you've picked this up later on today that our recording works. We can get through any technical difficulties. I was away last Tuesday, so we're going to pick up where we left off. We are going through a series I'm calling Gospel Hospitality by looking at the book by Rosaria Butterfield, The Gospel Comes with a House Key, and it brings us to chapter 9. And chapter 9 is called Blessed are the Merciful, the Hope of Hospitality. And as I have been doing, I'll take a few selected passages to read them directly from Rosaria's excellent writing and make a couple of comments. I've been encouraged by an increasing number of you letting me know that you've got the book. I've seen it kicking around the sanctuary as well, so I know some of you are reading it. And so just again, a reminder for those of you that are just coming to this book now, as I said near the beginning, it's pretty radical, and the Butterfields, Rosaria and her husband Kent, have a way of doing hospitality that's not only compelling, but probably a little bit fear-inducing as well. So I've encouraged you to do it, to read it prayerfully, and to pick up the principles out of it rather than seeing it as something that's prescriptive and definitive, and you've got to do hospitality in the same way that she does. Her very first story is in the book is picking up the story of their neighbor Hank, and we found out that ultimately Hank was arrested and for being a meth producer, crystal meth producer. So obviously that in itself, she's living in a context that most of us, many of us, will never live in. And but still, we can. There's so many principles that this book conveys to us that are encouraging us to be, I think, more open to how the Lord would lead us to reach out in ways that perhaps we've never considered before. So without further ado, let's pick this up. I'm going to start right on page 179, read a couple of pages, and she is actually returning to this story of Hank, that surly neighbor, the one that was so hard to get to know. And this brings us to May 12th, 2016. The Butterfields knew Hank. They were friends. Could they have known about the meth lab? That is what our neighbors told the police that morning when they arrested our neighbor Hank and his live-in girlfriend, Amy, for cooking crystal meth in the basement. All eyes were on us because we had worked hard to befriend Hank and to include this lonely man into the rhythm of our lives. He was not easy to win over. The truth is, although we had shared meals, holidays, and countless dog walks, it took a whole year before we knew his last name or had his permission to text him on his cell phone. But once we became friends, we loved and appreciated him, and he us. After Marion Knox helped find his missing dog, Hank trusted us. Hank said it best one day. He said, "You guys are my pack. That's cool." Watching the DEA, that's the Drug Enforcement Agency, drag out Hank and Anne from the scandal and secret of their addiction was painful. Hank was ashamed, head low, not able to look at us. Amy was flying high as a kite, her pink hair wild like her eyes. She made eye contact with me and waved. She blew kisses to my children like a homecoming queen or a princess. The police detoxed Hank and Amy with less dignity than they gave Tank, fire-hosing them into sobriety, jerking them ragdoll roughly. Protected by white hazmat suits, they could treat them like subhuman trash. They thrust them on the ground like garbage when they were finished, leaving them to drip dry where they landed. It was inhumane and wretched to watch. This is the process by which image bearers become prison numbers. Lost people, nobodies. Hank was no longer our neighbor. He had become an object lesson about what not to be. The police knew we were neighbors who knew Hank best. By 6:30, we had provided them with Hank's mom's phone number. We told them that we would take responsibility for Tank, the enormous and depressed 100-pound pit bull. One of the officers is a pit bull lover, and she was thankful that they could just hand Tank over to us. She said pit bulls sprung from meth labs don't last long in the pound. But now we were fingers as friends, not just informed neighbors, but friends of the evil one. That was true, and it cast us in a different light. That the whole neighborhood accused us of loving this sinner was likely the best Christian witness we have ever had. But that doesn't mean it was pleasant. By noon, our house was like a trauma center, with the DEA and other members of the police team using our kitchen and bathroom, and with neighbors coming by in a steady stream of concern, lament, and criticism. Tank was bathing in kid love and playing in the backyard with the other dogs. The world was compartmentalized by snapshots of normal: kids, dogs, forts, frogs, and insane. Crime scene tape, neighbors complaining to the media about housing prices that surely now would plummet. Hank, shivering in the warm day, dripping wet from the shame of a public bath. By 1 o'clock, the DEA left our kitchen for good and returned to Hank's place. Before they left our house, they warned all neighbors to stay inside. When they opened all windows and doors at Hank's house, the nauseous toxins would be released into the air we breathe, and it would not be safe for us until 6 o'clock that night, especially given the proximity of our house to Hank's. The warning given was stern. Grief and sadness and anger mingled with the tangled feeling of entrapment. People were fuming. Bill, pacing in my kitchen and finishing up the last of the coffee from the morning, said, "I can't believe you could be friends with him. You want to know the problem with you Christians?" "No, Bill," I'm thinking, "but you're going to tell me anyway. You Christians are so open-minded, your brains are falling out of your ears. It takes God's grace to get your neighbor to polish off the last of the coffee and insult you in the same breath. Sissy, a sweet older woman, just held me and cried. 'That evil drug addict almost killed your family, your sweet family,' she sobbed in her Carolina drawl. More than one neighbor asked, 'Did you know about the meth lab?' More than one neighbor declared, 'You must have known.' Others asked, 'Did you call the police on him? How could you not have known?' The jury was in. The neighbors hated Hank and were not so very sure how they felt about us, knowing that we called him our friend." So that sets a very vivid picture, doesn't it? And I think what I want us to consider is really just along the lines of the title of the chapter, and it's mercy. And I think we sometimes struggle with knowing just where to draw the line in our friendships and communications with people that are not Christians. And I think the picture that she paints of how the police dealt with Hank is not only a vivid one, but it's a picture that's not all too often, I think, we see ourselves as we ought to don hazmat suits, as it were, to deal with people that are non-Christians, to protect ourselves from the outside, from that outside creeping into our lives or into our families' lives. And I think I hesitate to give you, I don't think there's a singular pastoral answer that answers that question of where you, as an individual or as a protector for your family, where do you draw that line? But I want to encourage you that it's probably further on than you think it is. I think God does, obviously we have to make that call in terms of protecting our family. And Rosaria herself is not suggesting that you do sleepover parties for your 8-year-olds with your drug dealer neighbors. But that being said, can we not trust ourselves to be a little more vulnerable than we are sometimes, and allow God to be our rear guard, as it were. Allow God to be our protector. Allow ourselves to trust that He will have the shadow of His wings, as Psalm 91 talks about, um, protecting us and freeing us to minister to those that are marginalized in society, and either marginalized by their own sin or by the sin of others. And I think maybe a good question to ask is that, uh, how are others to see the mercy of God? How are they to experience the mercy of God if they don't see it? If they don't see it walked out in the lives of our lives and our families' lives? Is God's mercy on display through your life to somebody else? That's a great question, I think, to think about. And, I've come across, Christians over the years, friends, and they'll tell me, I'm not sure that I have any singular friend that's not a church friend, so to speak. And I think that's sad. All of us ought to be, how are we to be salt and light in the earth if we are not rubbing shoulders with those who need Christ, who need to see that mercy of God that we so need? I'll push on here. A couple more readings that I wanted to cover. Why don't we turn to page 182? Obviously, this was a big event, and Rosaria goes on to describe this as not merely a big event for their street. This was the largest meth lab bust in Durham, North Carolina. So it attracted all kinds of media attention. It was on news, television, radio. So this was far beyond just their little neighborhood. And what they did, they ended up deciding to, because obviously the community is a buzz with this, lots of questions and lots of chatter, lots of gossip. So Kent and Rosaria decided to have a Sunday, I think it was the second Sunday after the event, have an open invitation to come by their house. And as they often do, they'll put out up to 300 invitations. Not all those people come, but they often are having dozens of people cramming the front and back gardens inside the house, putting out soup and bread simply, and giving people in this event, in this instance, just a chance to breathe and to talk and to sort of commiserate because of this event. And so picking this up on page 182, Rosaria writes, after we prayed together, so this is on that Sunday when they had gathered as a community at their house, Kent turned to me and said, would you have done any of this differently? I knew what he meant. Our neighbors were fuming mad at Hank, and their anger was spilling over to us. Had we missed some important clue? For the past 2 years, our neighbors had been warning us about Hank. They had just had a bad feeling about him, they would say. Were they right and we wrong? It sure seems so. Not a thing. Jesus died with sinners. So do we, I said. Right, Kent said. Being known as a friend of sinners has an edge to it I hadn't felt before. But it is a compliment, really. This is what Jesus does. But I sure feel the edge. That edge was ours now, like it or not. And here is the edge. Christians are called to live in the world, but not live like the world. Christians are called to dine with sinners, but not sin with sinners. But either way, when Christians throw their lot in with Jesus, we lose the rights to protect our own reputation. And boy, that's a good thing to contemplate. What holds us back from being the kind of person that is going to display the mercy of God to somebody who needs it? Are we willing to risk our reputation? She goes on to say that they wrote 2 letters. One they wrote to Hank, who is, of course, now in prison, and one they wrote to their neighborhood. So they ended up having, I think, several months after, I think it was about 8 months later, they had a snow day, which is unusual. They're living in North Carolina. Not many snow days down there, but they had a snow day on a Saturday, Sunday, and churches were shut down. So uh, what Rosaria and Kent did was open up the neighborhood to come to their place for an informal worship service right in their home on Sunday since churches were closed. And they had many people come by that day. And she describes that day in fair detail. I'll move to page 185, picking up where she says, as the sun set, about halfway down. As the sun set, I brought out the coffee cups. So this is at the end of their day, their worship service day in the home. People lingered over the sheer magic of coming together in tragedy and strife. We stayed there drinking coffee and picking at potato salad until it was too dark to see our forks. Neighbors walked home in funeral procession, sore with shock, but warm from the persevering companionship of empathy, from being in the company of people who understand, and from belonging to a tribe that had just experienced something together, something that will always bind us. Neighbors embraced as they departed. Wiping runaway tears with the back of a hand, one neighbor told Kent that she had been a little girl in a Baptist church who had once believed what Kent said about Jesus saving sinners just like us. She hadn't thought about that in 20 years. She wondered if Jesus was still waiting for her. Another neighbor said that the pastor of his church had talked that morning about the meth lab in Durham, but hadn't put a personal face on it. Either the personal face of Hank or the personal face of Jesus. Another woman said that at work that week, someone had said that rotting in jail for life would be the just outcome for that awful meth addict. Another neighbor responded that Hank's Christian neighbors would stick with Hank because that is what Christian neighbors do. It was a procession of hope, a vision of promise, a drop of expectation of something good coming out of it, even as yellow tape unveiled shame, a neighbor missing, a house quarantined by crime scene. The hope of Jesus was proclaimed in an ordinary neighborhood barbecue. I'm going to pick up one more quick reading and then we'll close. Yeah, here it is. So concluding, I may have the timing wrong of when that Sunday afternoon was, the snow day worship service. I may have that. I think there was maybe one other neighborhood gathering before, and then they had the snow day. And this now is concluding the snow day. Kent was letting everyone know that how they asked for an update on Hank, and he, after his little sermonette, he said Hank had actually come to Christ whilst in prison. And so Rosaria then writes after that update that this captures the gospel in real time. It's hard to explain what happens to a community when the local drug addict commits his life to Jesus, but I suspect you can imagine it changes everything. Slowly, people start to talk to each other again. We have finished most of the food, so cleanup is easy. We load the dishwasher and find coats and hats and boots. The children stay back to watch a movie and play in the snow. As shadows lengthen into the dark, winter, late afternoon, neighbors reclaim their dogs and soup pots. Slowly we put all back into our separate homes. We know that we have experienced something sacred, neighbors from all stripes coming together to worship God and break bread together. And Boo Radley is no longer the scary dude with tattoos and a mysterious addiction. He is my neighbor still, and he is made in the image of God. I'm already almost at my limit here time-wise, but there's just one more quick little paragraph I'd like to read that I think closes things down nicely. And again, we're trying to consider, I think, how do we bring the mercy of God to bear in someone else's life? We have received such deep mercy And do we not want somebody else to see that same mercy? And that takes getting messy with people. One, they have to see your life such that it's the mercy of God that's evident. It's not you as some polished, finished product. Uh, you know, and we don't, if we are coming at the world around us in that sort of that vision of the hazmat suit, sort of picking up our neighbors, as it were, at distance, so afraid of their contamination of us. No, I think Jesus, just as Jesus went into the world and touched the world and cleansed rather than being polluted, that's what he anticipates us to do as the salt and the light of the world. So Rosaria relates this story of two men. It comes out in a book called How to Survive a Plague, and it's about the AIDS crisis, and two men. That's one of them saying, "I hope when my time comes that I can face it without turning to God or religion, because if I do, that would be a betrayal of everything I fought for and everything I believe in." That's a very stark statement, and it's a depressing one, isn't it? It's hard for us to hear that. And while Rosaria was reading that in that book, she says the stark power of those words made her gasp. The greatest fear, she surmises, the greatest fear of man standing on the brink of eternity was turning to the God who made him. How would you listen if you were at a table having lunch with those two men and you heard that statement? What would you say? She asked, would you want to be at this table? Then she asked more pointedly, why aren't we at this table having lunch with these two men? This is a challenging book, and I trust that the Holy Spirit is actually working in your heart. If you've been following along, even if you're just hearing my readings and my little quick reflections, or if you've actually got the book, again, encourage you to do it prayerfully. These are pretty radical notions sometimes, but I think, again, this principle, if you ask yourself that question, like even that little conversational uh, conviction that comes, I guess, to our hearts when we realize, yeah, too often I'm not at that table hearing that kind of objection to God or objection to the gospel. Well, what is going to bring us to that table? What is going to bring the church to those that need the church, that need to see the mercy of God? We'll continue on this path. We've got 2 more weeks before we finish out the book. I've really enjoyed going over this book again. I hope you have too. Join us tomorrow as Andrew continues his table talks in the Psalms. And goodbye for now. We love you.